Hello, and welcome to T2RL Talks Conference Special. And today we're talking about simplification and efficiency, which is one of the promises of the new technologies around airline retailing, or OOSD, as we tend to call it within T2RL. In the studio with me today, I have Chris Bird, who is a senior consultant with T2RL. And I also have a special guest, which is Pascal Greber from Lufthansa Systems, who will be participating in the T2RL Engage conference in September. And the discussion we're about to have is really just a taster for the much more detailed discussion that we will have in London in September. So good afternoon, Chris. Good afternoon, Pascal.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
And as I said, simplification and efficiency is one of the promises around offer, order, settle, deliver, or modern retailing that airlines are expecting to see delivered over the next few years as we make the transition to new systems. But it's not just going to happen by magic. And I think one of the key skills around IT systems in airlines and any other industry is managing standards. And standards has been a very interesting process, the definition of those standards through IATA and other organizations over the last few years. And some would say that as an industry, we haven't done such a great job. But Chris, maybe just talk a little bit about the importance of doing a good job on setting those standards if we want to see the benefits of simplification and efficiency.
Sure. Thanks, Ian, very much. Yeah, I think the key point here is that standards by definition evolve. And at the very beginning of setting up standards for anything, we realize that they're not going to be perfect. And so we will put in place an early standard and then have to manage the increasing change to that standard. So thinking about simplification, making sure the standards stay as kind of almost static as possible, and make sure that they are easily consumed, easily managed, easily understood by those organizations that need to adhere to them. And I'm going to divert to a well-known retailer, and that's in the Amazon space, where Amazon is able to say, if you want to play in my sandbox, you use my standard. And if you don't use my standard, you don't get to play. We don't have that kind of authority, although we have a number of loosely connected standards organizations. And we need to make sure that those organizations themselves kind of coalesce around a solid standard that can be used and can be effective for what we need to get done. But it's not just a case of, oh, we've got a standard now, great, let's go for it. It's actually managing the evolution of the standard, because the standard will evolve over time as new ideas, new capabilities, new things come into play. So the standard at least allows us to talk to each other. Now, making sure that we adhere to them, make sure that we don't allow for competing standards. Oh, I'm going to use my version of the standard and Pascal's going to use his version of the standard. We're not going to, that doesn't work. Standard is a standard is a standard. It's not my standard and your standard. It's a standard. And so I think really coalescing around a standard is a really important piece of what's going on. And with what IATA is doing is very helpful, but we've got to keep the pressure on to make sure that the standard stays in place.
Okay, so Pascal, Lufthansa Systems is an organization I've known directly for at least 30 years, and it's been going for longer than that. You've got lots of experience of working together with other vendors and with airlines in really quite complex environments. How do you see the process of defining and implementing new standards going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Well, we have been very active in the IATA working groups, and I'm happy that we are, because it really makes a difference to be active as a vendor and to see how the standards evolve and influence that whole in standard definition. So we have seen that the standards evolved in the last couple of years very quickly, actually. There is still a lot of gaps that we see, and that needs to be fulfilled, especially, for example, when it comes to interlining and cooperations between different airlines. There is a gap that we see, and also the whole order servicing life cycle. That's stuff that we haven't touched too much yet, but we are about to get there. And especially seeing this year a lot of airlines starting their transition, starting to put pays on the track. I believe we will be seeing a lot of involvement in this year, and we hope to be part of that of the journey, and looking forward to work together.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you mention interline, because that's an area where I think the standards have been slow to evolve, even for NDC, much less the maybe bigger and more scary move to offers and orders. Why do you suppose it is that interline has proved so difficult to create standards and implement those standards?
There is a lot of complexity behind interlining, and coming from a financial management background, I do know that, especially also in that area, we do see a lot of struggles, and that airlines have been working on that struggling in the last couple of decades in the legacy environment. And one thing that we have seen so far is there is a tendency to just take whatever we had in the past and transform it into something order based. And I believe we need to detach a little bit from that mode and really step into that new field and seek for new options. Let me tell you one example where we see that happening right now. The example of proration. It has always been done in the revenue accounting area, but when we look at offer creation in the future, it needs to contain what is today a proration. I'm not sure if it's even called that way in the future, but we need to see that's happening in the offer creation. And it's a complete change from having that in a backend system to getting it in the real front, being real time available for the customer to be able to create offers in real time, obviously. So that's yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. And just to sort of declare an interest here, I was a member of the IATA Interline NDC working group for several years. And one of the very first things about Interline that was agreed within that group and within IATA more widely is that Interline offers would contain settlement values. And that's essentially the upfront proration that you're talking about. But to my knowledge, nobody out there in the world is yet doing that. So it's an example of something that's generally agreed, but maybe has just been put onto the too hard pile. Chris, I want to come back to you and say,
Yeah.
do you think as an industry we're guilty of just trying to do the things we've always done but change the surface layer? Are we just trying to wrap APIs around processes that haven't really changed?
I mean, the simple answer to that is we're doing a fair amount of that. The slightly more nuanced answer to that, I think, is that we're actually not technology companies, even though we need technology desperately to do our work. We're actually in the business of putting passengers onto aircraft, onto flights, charging them for it, collecting the money, etc. And if we take too big an inward focus on just changing the technology, then the sort of simple-minded view of it is then we'll just change the surface to make it look like we're doing something different. But actually, we don't want to spend vast resources in completely retooling the underlying infrastructure, the underlying components of our airline, if it's not going to make us get more people on more seats, giving us more money. And I think as technologists, we sometimes lose sight of who pays us. And so we look for clever solutions, and we have been known on occasions to make them rather large and somewhat overblown, without necessarily providing the underlying value that we need. So I think, in whatever we do, when we're talking about simplification, when we're talking about adoption of new approaches, that the let's rip it all out and start again is fine if you don't have an existing airline. I really don't want to be refueling the plane while it's still flying. I know you can some, but typically passenger aircraft, we don't do that. What I want to be able to do is to be able to gradually move those bits that can be moved, recognizing that I still have to keep a profitable, hopefully, enterprise running. And so there's naturally a tendency, as humans, where we can be a little change resistant at times. There's naturally a tendency to do what we've done, but also we have this big tendency or this big need to make sure that we are actually staying in business. And it's that balance. So I don't think it's entirely malicious that we are trying to bolt on things onto what we've already got and change the surface. But I think it's in some ways it's quite pragmatic, because what's going on behind the scenes is what's giving us our paychecks today. And we've got to keep that in
Okay.
mind as we go forward.
Picking up on something you said there, which is that airlines in general are not technology providers. And in a way, that's a big difference in the environment today compared to the environment of 30 years
Yeah.
ago, when current standards like EDIFACT were being defined. Back then,
Mhm.
many airlines did have fairly deep technological expertise. Now, most of that expertise is in the hands of the technology vendors. And I think it's important that the technology vendors should be very much engaged with the standard setting and implementation process. Pascal, you're in an interesting position because you're from a technology company that is actually part of an airline group. So in a way, you've got a foot in both camps there. Um, do you agree with me generally that the technology vendors should be much more involved even than they are today in creating and implementing those standards?
100%, 100%. So this is an indeed interesting position, being in that company owned by an airline. And it's not always easy, because as a vendor having a close connection to a specific airline, we also have are always being confronted with being too close sometimes, even though we aren't. Um, but it's really good to be part of the IATA working groups and to engage in that standard definition. We have seen that, and I'll bring an example. I mean, the whole thing is also about modularity, so having different vendors working with each other. And in the past, it has always been a real big thing if we want to get attached to another vendor or if we want to communicate with another system. It was a real big thing. And right now, we already established 3 different partnerships with big other vendors, and it worked pretty smooth. It is really cool that we are having these standards which we can use. And obviously, there's always the need to find ways to work with each other, but it really works out. We can say that from practical experience, and that's why I truly believe that it makes sense to get engaged in these working groups, and that's also the reason why we are still very engaged in doing so. This is really something I would empower and encourage everyone to do as a vendor, because it really helps you to be part of that movement and to be at the forefront of empowering modularity.
Okay, and modularity is a word that you're going to hear time and time again during the T2RL Engage conference in September, because it is one of the critical factors that will determine the success of the vision for modern retailing standards. Um, as we've seen so far, and we're recording this at the beginning of June, we've got about half a dozen airlines that have signed up for modern retailing systems from one of the big vendors. What we haven't seen yet so far is many airlines coming along and saying, yes, we're going to assemble our commercial environment, taking components from this vendor and that vendor and one we've built ourselves, and we're going to put them all together. And I think, at least in part, that's because we're still lacking some of the standards needed to do that. IATA has published a capabilities architecture for modern retailing with about 60 boxes in it. but where is it defined how those boxes get fit together? Is it going to be the case that just the first people into the market with working solutions will effectively define de facto standards? Is that what's happened in the past, Chris? I think in many cases it is.
It absolutely has been that way in the past. Although the first mover advantage that you might get from that isn't always the sustaining mover advantage. Um, but we see that time and time again. We see that in the PC market when it first evolved. So yes, I'm sure that the big and the powerful, both vendors and airlines, will have massive influence on the shaping of those standards. It would be nice if the kind of strongest survive, and so let's have an evolution theory view of that. So natural selection kicking into, but that's potentially actually a barrier too, because if the standards are perceived to be incomplete or certainly not complete enough for a specific airline, why would I go in on Joe's standard versus Bill's standard? There's no obviously good reason, because if I bet on the wrong horse, then what's going to happen? And so you see things like some of the old OTA standards and a few of the other standards that evolved over. I'm looking 10 years ago now. It wasn't clear which set of itinerary management standards were going to win, and it's still not clear, and nobody's really doing very much in that space. So when you're thinking about barriers, the which standard do I hook my wagon to or hook my tug to is a risk, I think, for some of the others. So rather than adopting one of them and moving forward, it's a case of saying, "Ooh, I'm not sure. I'm a little bit risk averse. I've got too many other things to think about. So let's just defer that until the standards are a bit better in place." Whereas some of the larger organizations, and taking Lufthansa as a good example here, are saying, we want to be the standard setters, or wrong. We want to be involved in the group that sets the standards. It's a more important way of saying it, I think. And so really want to kind of lead the charge, whereas some of the other larger airlines are focused on other parts of their own business models and eventually getting to, oh, the standards are now mature enough, I think I'll join them. So back to that very first set of observations you made, Ian, that standards are key. The standard being the right fit at the right time is one of the things I think that will encourage airlines to get on board once they see that there's enough of it in place to make a difference to the way they operate, that they then can start to deliver the value of the promise of offer, order, settle, deliver.
Okay, and yeah, I think that's an interesting observation about the almost like a hockey stick curve for adoption. It all looks very slow until it doesn't,
It
and I
doesn't,
think
yeah.
I think maybe over the next year or two we're going to see that inflection in the hockey stick curve, and we're going to see a lot more activity as airlines that have so far been taking exactly the view that you talk about, let's wait and see, realizing that the time for waiting and seeing is rapidly running out. Pascal, I'm guessing that might be something that you're beginning to observe in the market when you talk to airlines.
Yeah, and actually, what we could see as well is also that the airlines doing modular setups and requesting modular providers, they do tend to need a little bit more time to select. But still, I mean, there is a risk coming with having just one single big solution. And you have mentioned it quite well. If just one monolith is getting all the power, I mean, there is no point in having modular standards, and that can define like whatever they want to just go with it ahead. So I do feel that airlines have recognized there is a need for modularity. I do have the feeling right now it picks up a lot of speed. At least that's what we see also in requests from airlines. And I'm really positive about that we will see more modularity also in reflection with a lot of happening this year on the POC and piloting front.
Okay, and I think that as airlines aspire to implementing these modular solutions that will require a fairly high degree of skill in integration, there's a whole other area that we have to consider, which is where do you find the skilled resources to assist with those integration projects? That is another subject that we'll be covering at T2RL Engage and possibly in another podcast, but it's probably too big to start at the end of this one. So I'd really just like to thank Chris and thank Pascal for starting this conversation. It is just the start. The meat of the conversation will happen in London in September from the 22nd onwards at T2RL Engage 2025. I hope that anyone who's listening to this will be sufficiently intrigued to come along and join the conversation and seek out Chris and Pascal for an extension of the conversation. I will certainly be there, and I will certainly be doing that with Chris and Pascal and with a whole bunch of other people who will be there in London. But for right now, I'd like to wrap up this edition of T2RL Talks Conference Special. I would like to thank Chris and Pascal, and of course, I would like to thank you for listening. And until the next time we meet, good afternoon.